Today, it's difficult to imagine the scale of the disaster that took place at Crécy in August 1346. 1,542 French lords and knights were killed, and more than 10,000 soldiers were massacred by English arrows. The English only lost 2 knights and 80 men. Edward's victory was total. After Crécy, cavalry would never dominate the field of battle as they once had. The era of the archer had arrived. Against all odds, Edward had destroyed Philip's army. But the 100-year War was far from over, and Edward was still a long way from snatching the crown of France. In 1347, Pope Clement VI condemned Edward for his barbarity in battle. A good Christian, the English king listened, and in September he agreed to a truce. The people of France would no longer live in fear of the marauding English. But little did they know, a far greater killer was on the horizon. In 1348, a plague known as the Black Death swept across France, and a third of the population died. In August, it jumped across the Channel and ravaged Dorset for the next 16 months. When the disease reached London, it killed 40,000 people. Overall, the plague killed around 25 million people across the whole of Europe, nearly half the population. As the plague tightened its grip across Europe, whole villages were abandoned, farmland deserted, and taxes were unpaid. The sudden shortage of money, men, and food made further war impossible. Then, suddenly, on August 22nd, 1350, Philip VI, the first Valois king of France, died. He was 57 years old. The following Thursday, Philip's body was brought here to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the necropolis of the kings of France. Today, he lies next to his son, King John II. Philip VI died leaving France devastated by war and plague. Historians blame him for having weakened the French monarchy by granting too many privileges in order to finance the war. It's true that Philip made a strategic error at Crécy. But he was a conqueror king who left France far larger than it had ever been. The frontiers of the country now stretched from the foot of the Alps to the powerful city of Montpellier on the Mediterranean. In Paris, Philip also left behind the impressive keep of Vincennes. It was finally completed by his grandson, Charles V. Philip also provided France with a much-needed son and heir, stability in uncertain times. In In 1350, Philip's son was crowned King John II. He was 31 years old when he inherited the throne. He was a stubborn but courageous warrior and was nicknamed John the Good. In 1351, he created an order of chivalry called the Order of the Star.
By St. Denis and St. Michael, I do thee knight.
John was convinced that chivalry was the only way to beat the English and seek revenge for his father's failure at Crécy.
Show yourself.
On the other side of the Channel, the Plantagenet Edward III was growing weary and ill. But he still hoped to wear the crown of France one day. He refused to give up, even if at the moment he did not have the strength to lead his own army. He entrusted all military operations to his son, Edward, the Black Prince. The Black Prince was cruel and ambitious. He also shared his father's appetite for the French crown. In October 1355, the Black Prince, who landed at Bordeaux, left his Aquitaine fiefdom. For the next 2 months, he swept through Languedoc, killing and burning. The Black Prince's tactics were exactly the same as his father. He wanted to terrorize the population and destabilize the new king. It was a strategy that worked brilliantly. Regions of France, pillaged and devastated by the English, took decades to recover from the brutal attacks. In the summer of 1356, the Black Prince and a small band of knights launched a raid towards the center of France. King John quickly secured the bridges over the Loire to stop the English. The Black Prince turned back, with King John in hot pursuit. On September 17th, he caught up with the English army at the gates of Poitiers. Ten years after Crécy, the second great battle of the 100 Years' War was about to begin. The Black Prince was cornered and outnumbered. Desperate to avoid a fight, he promised not to raise an army against the French for 7 years in exchange for a total pardon. But John refused. He wanted to make an example of his English enemy and finished what his father had failed to do. At dawn on September 18th, at Poitiers, the battle lines were drawn. The French outnumbered the English by nearly 2 to 1, and for once even the formidable archers could do nothing to help. All seemed lost, when suddenly, behind the French lines, an English banner appeared. The Black Prince had ordered a few soldiers to skirt around the French troops and surprise the enemy. The French panicked, and the Black Prince breached the enemy lines. On September 19th, against all odds, King John and his son Philip were surrounded by enemy soldiers.
Look out on your right!
The English were eager to capture the King of France, better alive, but dead if necessary.
Surrender!
In the end, King John had no choice but to surrender. After his victory, the Black Prince went to see his prisoners. John the Good and his son were on their guard. But according to the rules of chivalry, the Black Prince, Edward, showed generosity towards his conquered cousins. After fine wine, he served them a meal himself, kneeling as a sign of respect.
The will of God is neither evil nor a cause for remorse. You will be treated with the greatest regard.
He congratulated John on his bravery. He told him he had fought better than any man on the battlefield.
And even in defeat, you have honored your reputation and the House of France.
But the prince's fine words were of little consolation to the French king. Losing what should have been an easy victory must have been utterly humiliating. The next morning, John and his son were taken to Bordeaux as prisoners. They were surrounded by the booty stolen from the French towns and villages. A few days later, they were put aboard a ship bound for England. May the 24th, 1357, John the Good made his entry into London. He was imprisoned in the Savoy Palace. In France, Charles, the 18-year-old son of John the Good, was quickly named regent. But the inexperienced boy was completely overwhelmed by the pressure of leadership. Not only was his father in an English prison, but France was in the hands of mercenaries, terrorizing and pillaging villages and towns across the kingdom.
You must do something, Charles!
I know! I need to think.
The responsibility was all too much for the Dauphin, Charles. He desperately wanted to bring his father home and restore stability no matter the cost. But to do that, he would have to negotiate with King Edward of England. The English king demanded a ransom of 4 million gold écus and territories in France. He already held Ponthieu and Calais in the north. He now demanded Saintonge, the Limousin, Poitou, Rouergue, and Béarn, the equivalent of a third of the Kingdom of France. Charles agreed to pay the ransom, but refused to concede the territories. It would have terrifying consequences. In October 1359, the Black Prince once again set foot on French soil. And with him, 30,000 troops. The prince's objective was to show his strength and prove how weak the French monarchy was. The ferocious attack would culminate in his coronation as King of France at Reims Cathedral, the traditional place of consecration. But Edward would never enter the cathedral, because the citizens of Reims refused to open the gates of the city. So he changed course and set off for the capital. But Edward's army was too weak to take Paris by force, so he laid siege in the hope of forcing the Dauphin to surrender. But Charles held firm, and Edward was forced to negotiate a peace agreement. On May 1st, 1359, negotiations began in the little hamlet of Bretigny near Chartres.
Listen, you've got to understand, this is a very important cause.
After 8 days of discussion, the King of England was handed the territories he wanted and agreed to reduce the ransom for King John to 3 million gold écus. In return, Edward renounced his claim to the French throne. The treaty came into force in the fall of 1361. After a first installment of 400,000 gold écus was paid, Edward III finally released King John II. But that was not the end of the story. King John had to leave 3 of his sons in England until the final installment of the ransom was paid.
God bless you, my sons.
One of his sons, the 24-year-old Louis, the Duke of Anjou, escaped and ran back to France and the woman he loved. So King John was forced to return to his imprisonment in London 3 years after being set free.
In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti.
3 months later, on April 8, 1364, King John died in the Savoy Palace. He was 45 years old. After his ancestor, the sainted King Louis, John the Good was the second monarch in the history of France to have been made prisoner. King John's remains were taken back to Paris and interred in the Abbey of Saint-Denis, the necropolis of the kings of France. John the Good never gave up the crown of France. His eldest son, the Dauphin Charles, succeeded him as Charles V. Despite a difficult regency, he was to become a great king. Edward had failed to snatch the French crown, but he was proud to have weakened a kingdom as rich and powerful as France. The Treaty of Bretigny deprived the kingdom of a quarter of its territory. Population was decimated. Whole villages were abandoned. France was in ruins. Its people starved and bled dry. With the death of King John II, the first phase of the 100 Years' War was nearing its end, but France was preparing for her revenge.